Kia ora koutou. I say good morning. I think it's good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for joining our HVN webinar series on patent insights and regulatory and market insights as well. So today we have a bit of a double whammy in a good way. We've got two fairly detailed talks of about 30 minutes. Led by Peter Brown of Spruson Ferguson patent attorneys, and then followed by Michelle Cubitt, who's a regulatory specialist and consultant. Both of our speakers also are providing written updates in these areas, so do keep a good eye on the HVN website for that extra information and also the rest of the webinars to come. So today we're going to start with Peter's presentation on patent insights around micronutrient fortification, and then followed by talking about patent activity in the New Zealand food and beverage sector. And when he's finished, he'll hand straight over to Michelle, who's going to help guide us through brand storytelling from a regulatory perspective. Without further ado, I see we have a few more people coming, but I think we'll just get on with it, and we'll take any questions at the end of both of those presentations. Thank you, Peter. Over to you.
Thanks, Melanie, and kia ora all. Good to be back online, and hopefully everyone's doing okay after the big cyclone. And I feel a bit guilty because I'm based over here in Brisbane, but just to let you know, I did go through it about a year ago. We had some big floods here, so I feel your pain. So yes, just in terms of how the first part of what I'm going to talk about is micronutrient fortification on a global scale, and then focusing on New Zealand, like Melanie said, and looking at much broader, so not micronutrient fortification, but everything in general, just to give you an idea of where everything's sitting at the moment. So in terms of micronutrient fortification, the data that we're looking at is, like I said, global data. It's only since 2017 because there's quite a lot of data and I didn't want to overwhelm everyone. And primarily when we're talking about micronutrient fortification, really focusing in primarily on vitamins and minerals, but it does also include things like proteins, immunoglobulins, for example, probiotics, oils and fats, and flavonoids and those types of things as well. So you will see those types of things crop up in the landscape, but a lot of it is the kind of vitamin and mineral side of it. So yeah, we'll be looking at kind of big picture analytics and then narrowing down in terms of what are the specific micronutrients, what are the targets, and also looking at a few examples of what New Zealand's doing in this space as well. So when you look at this first graph, this is just, like I said, just looking from 2017 onwards. So it's very kind of narrow lens, and it looks at first glance like obviously things have been declining, but the devil's really in the detail. And what I'll show you on the next slide is that primarily this decrease is being led by a significant reduction of filings from Chinese patent applicants. This is not, from what we are aware of, anything to do with specifically micronutrient fortification. It's literally across the board. Chinese patent filers are significantly reducing the amount of filings that they've made in the patent space. It went through a massive incline around the 2014, 2015. I think it was due to the fact that the government was actually providing significant incentives for patent filers, and that's dropped off in recent years. So what we're looking at here is kind of where all the patents are coming from in this micronutrient fortification space. And as I was mentioning, a big chunk of them, about 60% of them since 2017 actually originate from China. But what's interesting is that, you know, obviously there's a 40% of those that are coming from elsewhere. And what we're going to be looking at is, you know, what are the types of innovation in this space coming from different areas of the world. And I go into a lot more detail of that in the actual written report, so have a look out for that. But I'm just giving you kind of a taste of it here. Something that's quite interesting, New Zealand, only six or seven patents in this space over the last couple of years since 2017. And even though that doesn't sound like much, it's actually on par with Canada, which also had 6 since 2017 as well. And bearing in mind that Canada has, what is it? I think it's about 35 million people. It's not too bad at all, really. Even though I am Canadian, I'm pretty proud that New Zealand is batting well above its weight here. Australia does pretty well over this side of the ditch with 30 applications since 2017. So I think this is just kind of showing a quick slide looking at what are the specific patents that have come out of New Zealand. And I'm not going to go into any detail other than just to mention, firstly, you might find it of interest that actually 3 out of those 7 that are shown here, I don't know how one managed to creep in compared to the 6 on the previous slide, but 3 of those are actually originated from Massey University. The one you'll see down third from the bottom is that flavonoid delivery system. That is actually, that is the, which one is that? That's the Flavo Plus technology, which Ali Rashnadinejad, sorry if I pronounced that wrong, Ali, is actually, that's the innovation that he was the key inventor on. And that originated actually through the high value nutrition funding and the project with that group. Specifically, it was originally towards rutin, but if you actually read the patent application, it's got much broader application to a wider range of micronutrients there. So that's a very interesting one. The other one that's worth, according to PatSnap, a significant amount of money is that Tropicana one. I don't have any details about that in terms of how it originated from Massey, but you can see on the patent register that Massey was involved in that at some point, and perhaps was transferred over to Tropicana. That's an interesting one. I will actually give you a bit of a case study in terms of a similar type of technology that's been developed in Australia on the next slide. So just hold that thought. And the top one is the micronutrient fortification process and its uses. That's actually the FairyPro technology that was developed back in 2012. And I'll also go into that in a bit of detail. That has subsequently been sold to Nestle now. So this Australian case study, this is a very similar type of probiotic encapsulation, similar to that Tropicana one that I mentioned on the previous slide. This is now being commercialized in Australia, started from Queensland University, actually literally about a 1-minute drive from my house in Brisbane. This was developed originally back in 2009 by one of the professors at the university here. And it was actually more broadly coined as this ProGel technology. And it actually has got much wider application to just food and beverage, but ultimately after some initial seed funding, some of the investors then decided to launch one of the initial products into Australia as this kind of probiotic beverage. And it's now in, what does it say there? This is actually an excerpt from the university website, UniQuest, I should say, which is the commercialization arm of the university. It's now been commercialized in, I think, over 2,000 supermarkets in Australia, over 1,000 stores. It's doing really well. It's expanding into Asia at the moment. But I think just a couple things I wanted to point out. The original technology was patented initially back in 2009 in terms of the patent application. And that, I think, really helped just based on the sequence of events that's happened leading through to commercialization. I'm sure that that patent would have been very helpful in terms of gaining additional investment. It would have been very helpful in terms of looking at potential alternative licensing opportunities beyond food and beverage application. This has potentially got application towards drugs and omega-3s and so forth. So lots of potential opportunities to spin this out in different ways. It's actually, don't know if you're interested in knowing, I think it's based around an encapsulation technology that uses a seaweed derivative. So have a look at that. If you can't find the patent, let me know. I'm happy to send it through to you, but it's a pretty interesting read. This is the FairyPro patent story. this is one that I'm quite passionate about because I was involved in it in the original drafting work back in 2012. So it came out of, I think it was Riddet University, Shantanu Das, a number of people were involved in that. You can actually see the inventors there on that middle patent screen there. But yeah, it went through a pretty big story, at least from the patent side. I don't know of a lot of details on the commercialization side of it, but Nestle acquired it in 2019. And obviously there was a big lead up to that. I believe quite a lot of back and forth and discussions and testing. That ultimately led to a KiwiNet award in 2020. The US patent was granted in 2022. And finally, it was commercialized in 2022 as well, last year. And that image on the right-hand side is actually, if you ever want to go have a look, just type into YouTube Nestle Vineyard, and you'll come up with all these crazy, quite cool-looking YouTube advertisements about the this new product that's on the market in Pakistan. So it's pretty exciting to see that, and I think it's a really good case study in terms of how we can develop these types of technologies, patent them, and get a lot of interest from big multinationals to take them to the world. I think on the Riddet Institute website, I believe I read that one of the things one of the key exciting aspects of this is that potentially could help with iron deficiency in, I think it was 1.6 billion people. So that's pretty impressive from little old New Zealand. I just saw somebody's, I've just admitted somebody else there, Mel. Okay, what are we up to? So in terms of micronutrient fortification by country, what are people doing? What are companies doing and institutes? So in terms of what the target molecules are, the key one that really stands out from 2017 onwards is vitamin C. And you can see that China, Korea, Japan, to a larger extent, but really, when you look at China specifically, it's got a real focus on vitamin C, whereas in the US, it seems to be kind of a lot more even spread across the board. When you look at the delivery systems being used, I should point out this is an AI tool that's PatSnap has recently introduced, and it's pretty impressive. Much like the OpenAI tool that everyone's talking about at the moment, but it's still not perfect. And so luckily I still have a job, but just in terms of I guess the key thing I wanted everyone to take away from this is that the real focus in the patent landscape seems to be around encapsulation technology, opposed to something like, solubilization or dispersion technologies. It really seems to be a lot of the emphasis being placed on encapsulation, similar to that, what was the example I gave? Flavo Plus is an example of that. Whereas something like the Fairy Pro would be more of a solution delivery that you can see up in the top left. So in terms of health outcomes, what's everyone focused on? At least since 2017, what's really interesting to look at is that immunity seems to be the real focus from micronutrient fortification. And it's not, interestingly, it's not kind of general malnutrition in this space. It's kind of, quite interestingly, these kind of problems that are seen in first world countries in terms of good digestion, preventing issues with your immune system, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, these types of things. An example of that, the Perky that I was talking about before, their real focus is around immunity. So that just really goes to show that is a real key focus area when it comes to encapsulation, or when it comes to micronutrient fortification. So just in summary, in terms of the first part of what I'm talking about, definitely the patent filing trend has been decreasing, but that has been largely driven by China. When you actually look outside China, things are relatively stable. China dominates the landscape with 59% of the filings. New Zealand's doing pretty well for itself, on par with Canada. Vitamin C and immunity are the key focus areas. Microencapsulation is a key technology that's being used. And I think, as I pointed out, we've got some great examples in New Zealand where we're really leading. We've got some really great technology to provide to the world, and it's great to see that happening. So now I'm going to change tacks and look more broadly at New Zealand and what we've been doing. We're now, because there's less data here, we're actually taking it back from 2010. And we're not looking specifically at encapsulation technology anymore. We're looking at the entire food and beverage sector. So what I've done to try and kind of make this a bit more easy to understand is I've kind of based the analysis on a comparison to a number of OECD countries, including the likes of Singapore, Australia, Denmark, Sweden, Netherlands, and Belgium, just to give us a bit of a taste of where we're sitting and areas that we're doing well in and areas that we're perhaps need potential further improvement or focus. And then I kind of narrowed down, looking at the big picture, narrowing down then to look at what are the key technologies and applications coming out of New Zealand, which companies in New Zealand are doing really well, which ones are, where are they focusing their attention, and then giving some examples specifically of some patented Kiwi innovation that is actually being commercialized, and I can show you those too. So in terms of, I don't know if a number of you might have attended a recent webinar and I showed this slide, but it shows the number of patent filings since 2010 in comparison to a number of other countries. And basically what you're seeing there is that New Zealand is the second to bottom, which at first glance suggests, oh, we're not doing very well, but given our population size, it's understandable. And even more understandable is the fact that what you're seeing there, those numbers on the right-hand side, is the R&D spend since 2020, or in 2020, sorry. And New Zealand does incredibly well when considering the relatively small amount of R&D expenditure in this space. Like, for example, you compare it to Singapore, there's $10 billion in 2020 versus $2 billion. So when you actually slice the data based on that, New Zealand actually outperforms most of these countries in terms of efficiency of how we patent compared to how much R&D expenditure is put into it. So that's actually quite exciting, and I think it's important for funders, government agencies to understand that we actually do really good, we develop really good innovation, patentable innovation, based, from this funding source. And the other way you can look at it, there's tons of different ways you can look at the quality of the patents that are generated. Obviously, one way is looking at how it's commercialized and how those products are performing, but another way is looking at the patent value. You can see that's on the left-hand column, so the bars, and on the right is on the line graph is the grant rate. So the patent value is obviously partially dependent on the number of patents and as a collective value, but there's also a number of other factors that go into that algorithm that PatSnap has. And what you can see here is that even though New Zealand and Singapore have a similar number of patent filings in this space since 2010, the patent values of New Zealand patents are actually, roughly or just more than double what Singapore is. So that's a good indication that the patents are higher quality, perhaps, than Singapore's. And then when you look at grant rate, we outperform countries like Singapore, Israel, and Australia in terms of the number of patents that go through to grant. That is also a good indication that the innovation is worthwhile and valuable. And obviously, it's not technically a patent could just be sitting in a drawer and not commercialized, but being able to get over the threshold of novelty and inventive step and being patentable subject matter is a good indication that the innovation that we're developing is really good. And now it's just about how do we get that to market effectively. So where do these countries that we're comparing to, where do they actually file their patents overseas? And I think something that really stood out to me here, I was expecting Asia, and in particular China, to light up in terms of, the darker colored blue, the higher the number of filings in that country. But what we actually found was that it was actually quite different to that. It was that most of the OECD countries, when they've got their patents and they're ready to file them overseas, is they tend to file them primarily in the US and Europe. And so I think that just highlights, and I've actually heard this from a number of commercialization companies recently in the food and beverage space, saying that they're actually finding it sometimes quite difficult to commercialize into China. It's such a complex market and so many different areas that they're actually primarily focusing, at least initially, on the other markets, sometimes in Asia. So, South Korea, Japan, Malaysia, those types of areas, as well as, obviously the other big markets, US, Europe, even seeing here in South America. So I think that's something to bear in mind when you're thinking about your commercialization strategy and how you're going to protect your innovation, is where are the biggest markets, and you can get a lot of this insights from the patent data in terms of where the other patent filers are focusing their attention to. Where are we at? Okay, so in terms of which companies are contributing to the landscape from New Zealand, the key thing I wanted everyone to take away from this slide is that, yes, there's a lot of the big companies like Fonterra, and they obviously contribute a significant portion. But on the left-hand side, you see the others that I actually drilled down to have a look at what that was all about. And primarily, that 51% is made up of filers that have just 1 or 2 patents. And I think that's actually really healthy. That means that the New Zealand innovation system's very diverse. There's a lot of players in the industry. It means we've got a lot of skills in different areas. And as I'll show you on the last slide, that, like I was saying, that there's a huge amount of interest and focus area in different areas. So there's lots of opportunity to leverage that and collaboration opportunities and exporting that wonderful innovation. In terms of key subject, again, this is PatSnap's AI tool that does this, so it picks up the keywords. Not surprisingly, in terms of subject matter, there's a lot that's related to milk products. So 10% relate to milk products, roughly 8% to food products. So when you look down at all these keywords, I've kind of compiled them all together. So about 20% of them relate to health technologies, where there's keywords like disease, nutrition, dietary supplement, product, inflammation, drug, that type of thing. 15% of the patent landscape relates to protein technology specifically. So looking at words like protein, recombinant protein, casein, enzyme. And interestingly, there's about 4% I saw that relates to, is it in this graph? Shelf life, so shelf life technology, and about 3% that relates to, microorganisms, which is also quite fascinating. So by commercial application, again, it's just depending on which way you slice and dice the data, but here it's suggesting that up to 56% of the patents since 2010 coming from New Zealand relate to health applications. And I find that's quite interesting, considering I just did a very broad search at this point, looking at any food and beverage patent in New Zealand, and a big chunk of them are related to health. So that's quite exciting from High Value Nutrition's point of view. I believe, I shouldn't speak on behalf of High Value Nutrition, of course. In terms of this data also suggests that about 47% relate to dairy applications, and 8% interestingly relate to sustainable innovation. So it's interesting to see that type of work coming through as well. So this, I think, might be my final slide, but I also wanted just to highlight some examples here of the products that I'm aware of that have been commercialized that have a patent behind them. And interestingly, a lot of these are actually related to health innovation. So we've already talked about the Fairy Pro story, so I won't talk about that again. That's down the bottom middle. Sunfed is more of an alternative protein technology, as everyone's aware. Anagenics and Arepa, so you can see Anagenics on the right, and Arepa on the bottom left. They're related to innovation, which really harnesses the power from bioactives from fruit in relation to gut health, and that's anagenics focus areas. And Arepa's is around that mental clarity area as well. Obviously, we've got A2 there looking at digestive well-being with its protein. You've got enzo-nutraceuticals up in the top right-hand corner. This is actually a good example. This is a good example of two companies in New Zealand actually collaborating well together. So if you look on the Arepa website, it actually talks about using the enzo pine bark extract in its product. And that's a really great example of two New Zealand companies working together, both with patents behind them. Comvita, obviously, with its honey and testing technology. You've got Fonterra with its infant nutrition. And on the bottom right-hand corner, I don't believe this has actually been commercialized yet, but it is progressing very well. Biolumix technology in relation to UV light treatment for improving crop yield and quality. So there's some really interesting stuff that's going on there. And I just think that we can learn from these case studies how companies are actually taking these to market, how they're advertising the patents in the space. A lot of companies are actually using it to kind of show off their innovative kind of culture of the business. There's lots of examples of licensing and selling the technology and collaborating together. So I think that this, a lot of people look at patents and go, oh, you're just using that as an enforcement tool. But I like to look at patents as a proactive way of actually increasing chances of commercializing and doing well in market. So I think just in summary, looking at the Kiwi food and beverage space, we're actually, even though small population, we're actually doing pretty well in terms of R&D expenditure and patent quality. The competing OECD countries focus on filing patents into US and Europe, and at this stage don't appear to be filing a lot into Asian countries and China. So I think there's some really interesting insights to be learned there. We've got a great ecosystem in New Zealand of innovators in different spaces and a broad range of technologies and focus areas. And obviously dairy is a key focal point, but it's really interesting to see that there's a big area that's very much focused on health coming out of New Zealand food and beverage space and the patent landscape. So that is actually it for me. I'll stop sharing. And I will hand over to Michelle.
Thanks, Peter. I'll just get my screen up.
Look at that, right on 9:30. Or
bring on. So thanks, Peter. I'll jump into what I've got here. So my part of all of this is a little bit of a switch into brand storytelling, which does still come under a few different bits of regulation. It's not just about food labels and ingredients. So what I'm going to go through here is a little bit on just understanding the framework around, you know, what is advertising and claims, so you can sort of understand the context of when something is potentially going to be worthy of further consideration around some of these other regulations I'm going to talk about, and also when possibly there's a little bit more freedom to operate. Touch on the context of when is it a story and when is it potentially a health claim. And it's becoming more and more popular. So there's a little bit of a discussion around social media and how it fits into all of this kind of space, and a very quick taster of how all of this plays out compared to international markets as well. Because if you're going to start a brand story and your ultimate aim is to export, then obviously anything behind that needs to be robust enough to be able to be flexible in terms of what's happening in other markets, because it's not a case of everyone's the same or everyone's equal. So if we just start with sort of the nuts and bolts of realistically what is considered advertising, so that definition there is just straight out of sort of guidance and regulation, and essentially what it means is, are you doing something that is intended to influence someone to basically purchase a product or service? If you are, probably going to be an advertisement, and this covers all channels, so it doesn't matter where you're pitching it. Even potentially labels can fall under this definition as well, but they also have further other regulation behind them. But it does mean that whatever story you're telling and wherever you're telling it, if the ultimate purpose is in some way to sort of promote your product or promote your services, then you do need to be aware of all of these things that come around advertising. So if we do a little bit of an example of a few different types of claims, at the sort of softer end of the scale, if you like, we've got things where you can have comparative claims. So obviously you're trying to say that something is more or less than something else. There's something different about one thing versus another. That's sort of anything within that comparative advertising space. There can be quite a significant amount of regulation within comparative claims. So that is a type of area to tread very carefully and to really do some research and some homework. A very popular area of claims nowadays is anything that's kind of considered within the green space. So anything that's talking about environmental impact, sustainability, all of those sorts of things. So whether it's talking about the composition of your packaging in a way that's trying to promote that it's better than, say, potentially the industry standard or something you've used in the past, or whether you're actually talking about natural or organic components within your product itself. The brand story, which is the bit that we're going to delve into a little bit more later, is really a lot of that's focusing sort of on the behind the scenes piece around the brand. There's a lot of, it can go into green claims, but there's also a lot of work around origin stories. Could be about the people and the culture and the commitment and the community behind all of it. The more technical types of claims that really start to have some very big pieces of rules behind them and a little bit more black and white in terms of what are they, is obviously you've got your health claims. So this is anything that looks at some kind of a beneficial health effect. There are authorized versions of this, and then there are slightly softer versions of it as well, which we'll delve into a little bit more. There are the therapeutic claims end of the spectrum, which is obviously outside the realm of anything that a food product can make. So this is something that's reserved purely for therapeutic products such as medicines, and very clearly language that's in that space that needs to be avoided. And then the good old standard nutrition content claims, where obviously you're talking about whether you have a lot of or very little of a particular recognized nutrient. So anything that's looking at implying or directly stating about an impact on health is going to be construed as a type of health claim. Obviously, any references to diseases or conditions or therapeutic actions will be something that's completely outside the scope of anything a food product can make. And these are some of the standard watch outs that can start creeping into different stories, especially if you're trying to tell, say, the backstory around how a particular ingredient was developed or how a particular reason for what product came from in terms of its origin story. But these are the sorts of words that you really want to flag and to keep sort of reserved, if you like. So if we give a few little examples, so when is it possibly going to be a health claim? Anything in the sort of free from stage is not going to be considered a health claim. So most of those sorts of free from statements that I've given there are all regulated as a type of nutrition content claim, potentially. Others, such as, say, dairy free, it's more just a case of having a factual statement about not having something in your product. The sort of middle ground here is things where, you're sort of talking maybe a little bit more than just a standard content type claim, where you're starting to delve a little bit more into emotion. So some of these can still stay outside of the realm of a health claim, but they can start creeping into sort of that grey area, especially, you know, things like better for you. Exactly where is that going? Is it better for your health, or are you just saying better for you in terms of how you generally feel? And then some very clear health claims are ones where, you know, you're talking about, say, an immune boost, you're talking about a direct beneficial impact that's happening for someone who's taking this product. And just on the very basic side of how all of this stuff is regulated here in New Zealand, and also this covers Australia to a little extent, because we share the same food standards code regulation. But essentially, health claims are regulated in a particular way, so that you've either got pre-approved claims, which is where this Schedule 4 in the food code comes in. And so it's very clear, here's what the claim is, here's what the conditions are for you to be able to make that claim. And something else to keep in mind throughout all of the health claims journey here is that we do consider the overall healthiness of a product. So if you are wanting to look at more in your brand storytelling space, and you do have the ability to make a health claim, there is the possibility of bridging between the two. But when you're looking at this permitted health claims space, it does mean that you do need to consider the overall nutrition profile of that food, because high sugar, high fat type products are very much unable to make health claims here. It's not the same internationally. There isn't necessarily that level of restriction, but it is something to keep in mind for here. And we do have a self-substantiation option here. So you have the ability to conduct clinical trials or do systematic reviews to demonstrate that there is sufficient evidence to support the type of health claim that you wish to make. So there's an entire process around your ability. So you're not just stuck with the stuff in Schedule 4. You do have options for your own ingredients and for your own evidence as well. Other claims, there is something else to be extremely aware of. So this goes beyond just the regulation I was touching on before, specifically around health claims for foods, and that is the Fair Trading Act. And that is quite a very broad piece of regulation to consider, but at the same time, it's a very meaty piece of legislation, because it's kind of the catch-all for everything. The requirements in this act are that basically everything you say cannot be misleading, and it must be accurate and truthful. And a very key piece to that also is that it must be able to be substantiated. There is varying degrees of what that potentially means, but you do need to look at that in the purpose of, you know, if you're going to craft a brand story and you're really going to say, talk about your social commitment or your sort of environmental commitment to certain aspects, you know, you're sort of saying you're committed to certain practices, or you're committed to supporting certain organizations, there does need to be the ability to demonstrate that that is factually correct. So if we go a little bit further into some examples, so if you're looking at brand storytelling, and it's really focusing on things around, especially emotion's a really big one with storytelling, where for the most part you're not going to get covered under health claims. So if you're talking about like examples here, if you're trying to show that you have tried to create something that is socially good, if you've tried to create something where, you know, this brand was founded on certain particular principles, then all of that kind of sits outside the realm of health claims. And so you're looking at more just that fair trading requirements, rather than those other pieces of legislation around specifically how you can make a health claim. Some health claims can potentially be quite grey, certainly the feel healthy and the feel well. Depending on the context of how that's made, it is something that may need to be investigated a little bit further. But certainly other things around, say, vitality or energizing and that sort of stuff very much are likely to be considered that you're inferring some kind of a health benefit to someone. So it pays to look at how those words are crafted into the overall story as to whether you are going to start straying into territory which is possibly going to cause you some issues. So I'm going to delve a little bit into how this all plays out in the social media space as well, but just very quickly, certainly there is a risk spectrum that goes on between different channels and different mediums. So if you're looking at cultivating a brand story, obviously it's going to be a slightly different version depending on where you're saying it and what that channel looks like. Labeling is very much an area that is considered to be quite tricky. So very often the approach is to keep those as simplified and as clean as possible. So you're saying a very short version of what your brand story is, but at the same time you're being very clear to sort of avoid some of those touch points which potentially could cause a concern. So words such as, you know, the health or any of the potential therapeutic implications. And then if you are committing some kind of social conscience claim within your brand story and those, being really, really careful exactly how that plays out. Whereas, you know, some of these other channels, these digital channels especially, there's flexibility around how you can tell that story. You're able to incorporate more videos, images, and those kinds of things. So you need to look at the overall context of what you're creating, not just the specific words themselves. And what we've got with social media is obviously they are still covered under regulations. There is in some circumstances quite a disconnect, so there will be places where perhaps boundaries are being pushed a lot more potentially than what is technically permitted. But at the same time, I guess some of that is recognition of how easy it is to amend and change content in this space. And a really big one at the moment, and this is actually playing out globally, not just here in New Zealand, is the responsibility that there is on social media influencers for the content that they put out. So historically, quite often influencers have tried to sort of push responsibility back and say, you know, I'm just the conduit, I'm just delivering the message that, say, this brand has given me. But now most advertising standards authorities are pushing back and saying, no, you've got a responsibility yourself to your audience to make it very clear what's going on. So there is a lot more expectation that when influencers are putting out paid for content, ads, those sorts of things, that they've done a lot more of their homework around ensuring compliance. And something just to touch on in terms of how something is advertised. So if you're an overseas company based somewhere else, but you are advertising to New Zealanders, even if you're advertising from overseas, the idea is that New Zealand regulations will fall for any advertisement that is intended for a New Zealander to see, or it's intended to influence a New Zealander to purchase. So even if a company is based in the UK or somewhere, if they are very clearly targeting New Zealand consumers, they still need to comply with all of our regulations as well. And that works both ways too. So if you're sitting here in New Zealand and you are very specifically targeting consumers in a particular market, you are responsible for making sure that that particular content does comply with those local regulations. So between 3 different entities here in New Zealand as to how advertising is looked after, I guess. So the broad end of it is you've got the Advertising Standards Authority here. This is probably the first place that consumers will go to if they're going to complain about an ad, if they take exception to something. And I'll delve into a couple of statistics around that space in the next little bit. And the other two that sit in behind this is obviously MPI is ultimately responsible for anything in the food standards code. So that is anything where there is possibility it's interpreted as a health claim that falls under their jurisdiction. And then MedSafe may potentially be someone that also jumps in if there's the possibility that there's some kind of implication around a therapeutic effect in some way. So that's where it's sort of quite key to make sure that your wording is clear as to where it fits on the compliance spectrum, because there's a few different people that are sort of watching out in different avenues in this space. An example I want to just touch on in terms of social media content. So I'm just kind of splitting this into when is the expectation that a brand is responsible for compliance versus when a brand is not responsible for compliance in the social channel space. So essentially across these three here, the common theme through all of this is if there's some kind of brand input, brand review or brand approval that goes on, then the expectation is that the brand is ensuring that there is compliance through any of these spaces. So if someone puts a testimonial on your website and they're talking about how wonderful your product is, something that it's done for them, that testimonial does actually need to comply fully with all of the requirements. So if someone's come in, they've had your really lovely beverage, for example, and then they start making claims about things that it's done for their health. If that's not consistent with a health claim that you are able to access, then there does need to be a sort of monitoring process that goes on to make sure that that testimonial either doesn't appear or you're able to work with the person who has placed the testimonial to ensure that any particular phrases or particular wording is not used, so that the overall testimonial is still factually accurate, but you have presented it in a way that's not implying some kind of an effect that you're not actually allowed to do. And if we jump over into uncontrolled content, so these are situations where it's not normally expected that the brand is going to be responsible for compliance. And the theme across all of these, again, is if there are no controls in place for the brand to influence or be involved or have any kind of review and approval around that content, then the responsibility doesn't sit with the brand. So someone's put some review of their own on social media and there's been no involvement, no connection with the brand itself, then that content can stand as it is because it's not something that you have had the ability to directly input into. If we have a look at some of the complaint things that go on, so these are statistics that come out of the Advertising Standards Authority every year. The most recent report they've got at the moment is still only from 2020, so potentially this is going to evolve even further. Potentially the advocacy piece is going to change a little bit with a lot of the stuff around complaints in terms of various COVID messaging and things. But at the moment, the statistics are sort of fairly similar, and it's quite interesting to see that between food and beverage and therapeutics, there is quite a similar percentage in terms of the number of complaints for both. So there are people who are looking out in these spaces around what is being said and is that actually compliant with all of the advertising requirements. This won't specifically go into whether a health claim is permitted or not, but this will look at the overall compliance of a brand with the standard advertising codes to make sure that everything is sort of above board. If there was something further than that, then that's when it starts to get referred to MPI for sort of technical detail around permitted or non-compliant health claims per se. An interesting one, though, is that there's been a significant jump in the amount of complaints in the digital space. So traditionally, television has always been the highest. Probably about 2 years ago, that digital complaints piece was not even close to 20%. And now it's really jumped up to be almost on par with television. So it's clear that there are a lot more people watching, and majority of this is actually Facebook ads for the most part still at the moment. But people are taking exception, or they're doing some monitoring around what's going on in those social channels as well. Now, a quick skim through international regulations. You've seen a little bit of a flavour of how everything comes together here in New Zealand. The international system can vary, especially in terms of the specific technical detail around what is a health claim and how is it permitted and how that sits with advertising. It's a note to say, obviously, Australia is similar to us in terms of the food regime, because we do share the same regulations. There is a little bit of caution, of course, with their Therapeutic Goods Administration. They do potentially have slightly different interpretations around when something sits on that borderline with a therapeutic product. There are markets that are a bit more concerned with social decency, so this is something to be a little bit aware of in some markets, particularly possibly in Southeast Asia and things. So be aware that if you are making particular comments around sort of the backstory to a brand or what the brand stands for, just bear in mind these social decency pieces. And obviously some markets are a bit more restricted than others around health related advertising. So to give you an understanding, with Australia, probably the biggest thing to take away from here is that the ACCC, which is kind of similar to the Advertising Standards Authority here, but they have a lot more teeth. They're probably a little bit more probably like the Commerce Commission as well. With those, they are really now targeting social media influencers. That's the people they have in their line of sight. So if you're looking at doing any kind of advertising in those channels in Australia, just be very mindful that this is now an area that is going to come under a lot of scrutiny. It already is under a lot of scrutiny as of probably about a month ago, and that cleanup is going to continue on for a little while. Looking at Singapore, they've got a similar process in terms of how health and nutrition content claims work. The expectation is that all claims are substantiated, so anything that you're telling a story about, regardless of whether it's health related or it's something else, there does need to be the ability to substantiate it. So look at what your evidence is available for all of your different marketing type claims or the different things you're sort of telling a story about. And one thing that the Singaporeans have really leaned towards is limitations on unhealthy food advertising. They've made really great strides in the sort of high sugar beverage space. So there's now a whole sort of mandatory rating system that goes on. And with that rating system comes various restrictions or prohibitions around how various products can advertise. And the higher the sugar content, the more restrictive that advertising is. In Japan, it's important to know that their system is very much that unless it's a very certain recognized nutrient, you're going to fit into that food with function claims space. And essentially any kind of claim that you want to make about the health effect of a food, you need to go through this approval process first. And that involves a review of scientific evidence, not entirely dissimilar to the self-substantiated system that we've got for health claims here. But you can play in a little bit of a grey area in this space. So this is definitely where it pays to work with sort of in-market experts around how this translates, especially into Japanese, because obviously that's how it's all regulated on, is what Japanese claims look like. But to see how you can talk about how something potentially makes someone feels. It could be talking about this is for people who are concerned about X, Y, and Z, may not automatically push you into that food for function claims space. So there's a little bit of a homework to do around whether you are going to jump in there or not. China, just to really clarify, obviously there's a very restrictive regulatory environment in that space, especially with anything health related. This obviously doesn't cover anything that's in cross-border e-commerce. There's various social channels where obviously a whole broader conversation probably can be had. But an interesting one is that also in China that there are more celebrities who are starting to be held account for things that they are saying within their own social media. There is a bit more expectation that they are going to be presenting things that are actually factually true and correct, and not just relying on the brand to say, yeah, everything's fine, this is exactly how you need to present it. Just a little bit more individual responsibility, not unlike what we're seeing in some of the Western countries. And actually there is a similar thing happening in the UK and the EU. Certainly in the EU space, there is very much country to country variation. So don't treat the EU as just one entity and everything's fine for one, it's fine for all of the member states. There is variation between, so it pays to do a bit of homework around exactly what messaging you want to portray and how restrictive your target countries are, because some are easier than others. And there is, again, a similar theme here too, a lot more focus on influencer advertising and their responsibilities, and also looking more around unhealthy product advertising. So at the moment, they don't strictly regulate at the authorised health claims end around the healthiness of the product like we do here, but they are looking at the advertising end around potential restrictions for products that sort of fit into that unhealthy category. And then with the USA, interestingly enough, the term healthy does actually have specific criteria you need to meet to be able to use the term healthy on a food label or in a food advertisement. They've kind of defined what their expectation is in that regard. And something else that is, again, common across everybody is that they are starting to focus on influencers, but their expectation is that they are looking more at the disclosure piece. So what they're struggling with more is around influencers making it clear that there is some kind of a paid relationship going on. And it's quite interesting what they've defined as a brand relationship. So whether it's financial, employment, personal, or even family related, that's sort of expecting quite a broad statement around disclosure there. A lot of work to be done for this to actually be mainstream. There's still plenty of situations where it's not really clear when something is an ad or not. There's a lot of people in this space that are still not really doing much, but it is starting to be a bit more of a focus for the Federal Trade Commission, who sort of look after this more advertising space, if you like. So sort of in summary to all of this, it's really important to understand your context if you're trying to, say, develop a brand story. Is there a possibility something could be construed as a health claim within that story? Is the story mainly focusing on sort of, you know, some kind of positive impact? Is it really talking about the origin or the context to how a brand was created, a founding people story? Those sorts of things usually are fairly much outside the health claims space. Just a little bit of care around any implication of a potential health effect. You know, if something's been developed because someone has previously suffered from an illness and you want it to really create a game-changing offering, it does need to be probably a little bit softer around that health journey, just to make sure you're not starting to unintentionally cross over into the health claim space. Regulations do change in the advertising space, especially around interpretation. So it does pay to review your content regularly to make sure that you're still compliant. And lastly, do be aware of that risk level spectrum, understand, you know, where there is potentially more room to play versus others, and look at how you can evolve your story across those different channels and those different spectrums to see what you can do. So that's me. I'll now hand over to Mel.
Thanks, Michelle, and thank you, Peter, both very much for again sharing what is pretty complex information in a way with nice pictures and simplifying it to help us kind of understand how we can firstly look into those patent possibilities, and then secondly, if we're going to take them to market, how we can do so in a regulatory compliant way. So big thank you to both of you for your time once again. We do have, I think, a question that's come through from Ali. He's asking, how are the patents valued? Are the numbers that you showed, this is relating to the numbers you showed in the first table. And then there is the second question, which I'm sure you can see there, regarding how you found, I guess, your what you presented and why a flavonoid enriched spray dried powder, which was part of a second patent application, did not appear in that list.
Okay, so I think I'm off mute. Yeah, so to answer your first question, I think first point I would like to make very clear is that please take those valuations as, you know, obviously with a grain of salt. They are automated valuations through PatSnap's algorithm. They don't give all the information away. It's their trade secrets, their IP, but they do release some information to kind of let people know what are the kind of inputs. So we know, for example, that a lot of it is based around the company size. A lot is based around the technology area. So they've got algorithms to determine in that specific technology space the patent is focused towards, what are the other patents and valued at in that space. And it might be based on actual transaction deals as well, that inputs into that. There's also commercial market size, as from my understanding. They've got some basic numbers around that using their sister platform called Discovery. There's also input the number of years remaining in the patent term. So obviously patents have 20-year term. The status of the patent, so if they're granted or pending, the number of patents in each family has an impact. But I'd say that one of the bigger ones that I've noticed in cases that I've been managing is that the values tend to go up when you start to kind of transition the patent families from pending to granted, is when you start to see quite a big jump in the patent value. But like I said, definitely take them with a grain of salt. And if you are thinking about, you know, licensing or selling your IP, don't rely on this. This is just to give you an indication. You need to go and make sure you get proper valuations done. And a lot of that is actually based not on the value of the patent, it's the value of the commercial opportunity. And the patent is just the tool to help you structure the deal and have a framework around it. So that's really important to recognize. In terms of your second question, Ellie, so I don't know the specific details, but if you said that, you know, the patent was filed in January last year, patents have an 18-month window before they're published. So there's a good chance that the reason it's not showing up in this landscape is because it hasn't actually been fully published yet you know, since your initial filing date. But yeah, looking forward to seeing that. That'll be great. Hopefully it'll get on the next one.
Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Peter. Does anyone else have any questions that they'd either like to send through the chat function or just take the mic? Another question that's just come in, thank you. Jonathan's asking, I know the focus was high value nutrition, but was there any mention of food waste in the patents?
It didn't come out. I'd have to go back and have a look and maybe look for some keywords, but it didn't kind of show up in the New Zealand landscape that I was doing. But I just know from experience that obviously as part of that sustainability angle, there's a lot of companies that are very much focused on food waste. And not only from an environmental point of view, but from a cost savings point of view, there's huge opportunity there. So yeah, I know that there's a lot of emphasis being placed on that at the moment, for sure. Separate search. More than happy to. That'd be a great topic, actually.
Thanks, Peter. We'll give it a couple of moments to see if anybody else sends any further questions or picks up the mic. And just thinking about that sustainability piece, Michelle, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on where claims around, say, organic, in terms of being good for the environment, may stretch across into the health space in terms of organic foods are better for you. I'm guessing presumably then you would need to comply with both any criteria for environmentally sustainable type claims and any codes of practice or regulations there, together with the health claim type frameworks you talked about. Would that be right?
Yeah, so obviously there is specific regulation in the food space around your ability to call a product organic, but then going into further inference around how that organic is good for your health or potential properties that can be attributed to, you know, organic over standard, then definitely you do need to start watching out for those sort of health claim regulation pieces. And also probably something around how you can substantiate that also. So how you can say that it's particularly factually correct, and depending on exactly what context you're trying to put to that.
Thank you. I'm also wondering, well, it looks like we still have a good few people online, and just to give people time to put any further questions down. Michelle, is it worth mentioning a little bit about the therapeutic bill, health products bill, which is, where is that at? Could we perhaps have a tiny update from you on where that's at, and perhaps a little bit around that borderline between food and beverage, which is what we're talking about here in the high value nutrition space, and that borderline with dietary supplements?
Yeah, so in terms of how things are progressing at the moment, the shut-off for submissions was extended, so now everyone's got until the 5th of March, which is actually very rapidly approaching. And there is, it's at this point now where it's just obviously the framework's been put together. It's an exceedingly large bill because it does cover the entire spectrum. So there is medicines, medical devices, as well as what they're terming natural health products. There's a lot of ins and outs and all of that, and various views on exactly how that should be structured. But in terms of the overall presentation at the moment, it does pay to be aware of how that potential food natural health product interface is. It's not a black and white thing of if you have this ingredient you can no longer be a food, or if you've got this thing over here you automatically have to be a natural health product. It's the overall context to it. There are some questions around how it fits between our food standards code, then we've also got a supplemented food standard, and then this new TPV business going on. So there is questions around exactly how all those are going to play out, but there is potential for food products to cross over if people wish to. A little bit of it will look around, you know, format. Obviously you need to think if you've got a traditional food format, that's still going to be very much food regulated. But if you've got something like how Peter's been talking about different encapsulation methods and things, if you do start putting things into capsules, how that then starts to play out in terms of ability in the natural health product space. And then there's obviously going to be sort of specific and very different requirements around how those claims start to look compared to what you can do in the food claim space.
Thank you. Yeah, as you say, watch that space.
Very.
Yeah, it could potentially change things depending which camp you have a foot in, and I think many producers and ingredient manufacturers potentially have both. If you're dealing with, say, an ingredient that's sourced from food and can be utilized in both food and supplements, or even a beverage, which is probably even more, has the room for more confusion, doesn't it? Because it could look like a food, it could also look like a supplement. So yeah, definitely something just to keep an eye on, I think, and understand what the implications might be for your business, or the science that you're doing, or if you're planning clinical trials, what all those different regulations might mean for you. So that's a good watch out. Okay, well, I think can't see any further queries coming through on the chat. I think people are probably wanting to either get to other meetings or their desk or have some lunch. So we'll just wind up and say thank you again to both of you, Peter and Michelle, as always, for sharing your expertise and helping us understand how to navigate some of this complex information and get the benefits from it. Thank you for everybody that joined. And just a reminder that this will be published on the HVN or via the HVN website. And also just to keep up to date with us in terms of our LinkedIn posts and our websites. And that's both the Riddet Institute and High Value Nutrition Science Challenge. And of course, Peter and Michelle have their own lines of communication, and I'm sure they welcome any queries and support potentially that you weren't quite so keen to share online in the public domain. So thank you again to everybody, and just to close today also by saying that we're all thinking of everybody who has been directly affected around the